That fearsome demon in the old texts might look like pure evil, but it's not what you think, because once upon a time it was worshipped as a god. What we call demons today were often the beloved deities of entire civilizations, complete with temples, priests, and millions of followers who prayed to them for protection, love, and good harvests. These weren't minor spirits or folk tales. These were the central figures of organized religions that lasted for thousands of years, with elaborate rituals, sacred texts, and influence that shaped entire cultures. If we don't understand how entire pantheons were demonized, we miss the real history and the power struggles that decided which gods were remembered as divine and which were condemned as monsters. This isn't just ancient trivia, it's about how those in power rewrote the spiritual landscape of the world, turning yesterday's saviors into today's villains. The methods they used reveal something dark about how history gets written by the winners, and how religious conquest works not by destroying beliefs, but by corrupting them. When we look at medieval grimoires listing demons, we're actually looking at a graveyard of dead religions, where the gods of conquered peoples were transformed into monsters to serve their conquerors' purposes. The systematic transformation of gods into demons didn't happen by accident or through gradual folk evolution. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy that began in the early centuries after Christianity started spreading across the Roman Empire. Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and later Augustine faced a massive problem. Millions of people across the empire still worshipped the old gods, and these deities were deeply woven into every aspect of daily life. You couldn't buy grain at the market without passing a shrine to Mercury. You couldn't get married without invoking Venus. You couldn't go to war without sacrificing to Mars. Rather than simply dismissing these gods as fake, which would have seemed absurd to people who experienced their apparent power daily, early Christian theologians made a calculated decision that would reshape human understanding of good and evil forever. They declared that pagan gods were real, but evil. They weren't false idols made of stone and wood. They were actual supernatural beings, demons masquerading as divine beings to lead souls astray. This brilliant strategy solved multiple problems at once. It acknowledged the reality that people experienced when they prayed to these gods and seemed to get results. It explained why pagan rituals appeared to work. And most importantly, it gave Christians a way to incorporate existing beliefs while making them forbidden and terrifying. This strategy appears clearly in texts like the Testament of Solomon, written around the 3rd century CE. In this influential work, King Solomon commands 72 demons to build his magnificent temple in Jerusalem. But when you examine the names of these demons, something fascinating emerges. Many have names suspiciously similar to known gods from across the Mediterranean world. Beleth sounds like Beletu, an Assyrian goddess. Paimon resembles Pe-Amun, meaning he of Amun, referring to the Egyptian god. Marcosius has elements of Babylonian divine names. The text doesn't deny their power. It reframes it as demonic deception that only a wise king like Solomon could control and turn to godly purposes. By the medieval period, this approach had become standard practice across Christian Europe. The famous grimoire called the Lesser Key of Solomon, compiled much later but claiming ancient authority, lists these same 72 demons in elaborate detail. Each entry describes their rank in Hell's hierarchy, the number of legions they command, their specific powers and abilities, and the complex rituals needed to summon and control them. What the grimoire doesn't mention, what its medieval readers likely didn't even realize, is that many of these demons were once worshipped in magnificent temples across the ancient world, receiving prayers, sacrifices, and devotion from millions of believers. The genius of this system was that it preserved the old gods' reputations for power while completely inverting their moral status. People didn't have to stop believing these beings were real and powerful. They just had to start believing that power was dangerous and evil. The familiar became forbidden, the beloved became feared, and the protective became threatening. Let's look at how this worked in practice, starting with perhaps the most dramatic example, Baal's transformation into Beelzebub. In the ancient Near East, Baal wasn't a single god, but a title meaning lord or master, applied to many different storm and fertility deities across the region. The most famous was Baal Hadad, worshipped by the Canaanites as their supreme weather god. Archaeological evidence shows his worship stretched from Syria to Spain, with major temple complexes in cities like Ugarit where thousands of tablets preserve hymns, prayers, and myths about his mighty deeds. In Canaanite mythology, Baal Hadad was the hero who defeated Yam, the chaotic sea god, and Mot, the god of death and sterility. He was depicted as a powerful warrior riding storm clouds, wielding lightning bolts to defeat the forces that threatened human survival. When Baal fought, the very foundations of the earth shook. When he won, life-giving rain fell on the crops, and the world bloomed with fertility. The epic cycle of Baal's death and resurrection explained the changing seasons. When Mot temporarily defeated him, drought came, but Baal always returned to bring the rains again. People didn't just admire Baal from a distance, they experienced his power in their daily lives. Farmers watched storm clouds gathering and knew Baal was preparing to battle drought. They felt the first drops of rain and knew he was winning. They saw their crops growing green and strong and knew Baal's victory was blessing them. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 2500 BCE to 500 CE, people across the ancient world called on various Baals in times of need. Kings claimed Baal's authority to rule. Warriors invoked his strength in battle. Farmers prayed for his rains to water their fields. But in Hebrew texts, and later in Christian writings, this same Baal becomes something very different. The Old Testament already shows the transformation beginning. Baal becomes associated with idolatry and corruption, the false god that leads Israel away from Yahweh. The New Testament takes it further, calling Beelzebub the prince of demons. This name, Beelzebub, is actually a mocking corruption of Baal's original title. Baal-zebul meant Baal the Prince, or Baal the Exalted One, but Beelzebub translates to Lord of the Flies, turning the mighty storm lord into a master of insects and decay. Later grimoires complete the transformation. Medieval texts make Beelzebub one of Hell's top generals, commanding vast legions of lesser demons. His storm powers, once used to bring life-giving rain, now cause tempests to wreck ships and destroy crops. His fertility aspects get twisted into promoting lust and corruption. The weather magic that once saved communities from drought becomes the power to spread plague and famine. The god who defeated chaos becomes an agent of chaos. The rainbringer becomes a bringer of pestilence and decay. Astarte's transformation reveals even more about how this process worked, because she was arguably the most beloved goddess of the ancient Mediterranean world. Known by various names, Astarte to the Phoenicians, Aphrodite to the Greeks, Venus to the Romans, Ishtar to the Babylonians, she was worshipped from Mesopotamia to Britain. Archaeological evidence of her cult spans over 3,000 years, making her one of the longest worshipped deities in human history. In her original form, Astarte was called the Queen of Heaven, and the title wasn't empty flattery. She governed love, fertility, war, and the evening star Venus. Her dual nature as both love goddess and war deity wasn't contradictory. It reflected the ancient understanding that creation and destruction, birth and death, pleasure and pain were all part of the same cosmic forces. Phoenician sailors carried her image across the Mediterranean, establishing temples wherever they traded. Cyprus became especially sacred to her, with the temple at Paphos drawing pilgrims from across the known world. Even some Israelites worshipped her despite their priests' fierce protests. Archaeological excavations in ancient Israel have uncovered hundreds of female figurines that likely represent Astarte, hidden in homes where families continued worshipping the Queen of Heaven in secret. The prophet Jeremiah records women telling him they would continue burning incense to the Queen of Heaven regardless of his condemnation, because when they honored her, they had plenty of food and prosperity, but when they stopped, disaster followed. Her sacred symbol was the 8-pointed star, representing the planet Venus in its dual role as both morning and evening star. Her festivals celebrated the life-giving power of sexuality, the renewal of spring, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Temple prostitution, often misunderstood today, was a sacred act that channeled divine creative energy. Her priests and priestesses weren't just religious officials but healers, counselors and keepers of ancient wisdom about sexuality, childbirth, and the mysteries of life and death. Medieval grimoires turned this beloved Queen of Heaven into Astaroth, a great Duke of Hell who commands 40 legions of demons. The transformation preserved her reputation for power while completely inverting its meaning. Instead of governing love and fertility, Astaroth specializes in revealing hidden secrets and promoting laziness, almost the opposite of Astarte's active, life-affirming energy. The goddess who once protected women in childbirth becomes a demon who corrupts human desires and leads people away from productive work. Her 8-pointed star symbol gets reinterpreted as a mark of evil, appearing in demonic seals and ritual circles designed to contain rather than honor her power. Her connection to Venus becomes associated with dangerous temptation rather than divine beauty. The sexual energy that was once considered sacred becomes demonic lust that leads souls to damnation. Her wisdom about the mysteries of life and death becomes forbidden knowledge that damns those who seek it. Perhaps the most visually obvious transformation involves Pan, whose story shows how even a god's physical appearance could be stolen and corrupted. Pan was the Greek god of shepherds, hunters, and the wild places of the earth. He lived in Arcadia, the mountainous region of Greece that represented unspoiled natural beauty. Unlike the Olympian gods who lived in palaces and demanded formal worship, Pan was earthy and accessible. He had the legs, horns, and beard of a goat, reflecting his connection to the animals and wild lands he protected. Pan wasn't evil or even particularly dangerous, just wild and unpredictable, like nature itself. He represented the raw fertility and creative chaos that makes life possible. Greeks and Romans saw him as a helpful deity who protected their flocks, guided hunters to game, and brought abundance to the countryside. His famous pipes, made from reeds, could charm wild animals, inspire passionate love, or fill listeners with what they called panic, not terror, but the overwhelming awe that comes from encountering the raw power of nature. His worship was especially popular among rural people who lived close to the land. Shepherds left offerings at crude stone altars in remote valleys. Hunters asked his blessing before entering deep forests. His image appeared on coins throughout the Greek world, and wealthy Romans built elaborate shrines to him in their country villas. The playwright Aeschylus called him the dancing companion of the gods, and his festivals were joyous celebrations of music, wine, and natural abundance. But Pan's goat-like appearance made him perfect raw material for Christian writers who wanted to give Satan a visual form that would resonate with former pagans. Early Christian art began depicting the devil with Pan's horns, hooves, and hairy legs. The transformation was gradual but thorough. Pan's wild energy became diabolic temptation. His sexual nature became corrupting lust. His connection to untamed places became association with spiritual wilderness where souls get lost. The god who once danced with nymphs in sunny meadows becomes the ultimate symbol of evil temptation lurking in dark places. His musical pipes, which once charmed animals and brought joy to human hearts, become tools for leading souls to damnation through false pleasure. His panic, once the healthy awe that comes from recognizing nature's power, becomes the terror that demons use to paralyze and control their victims. Even today, when most people in the Western world picture the devil, they're seeing an image that comes directly from the Greek god Pan. The pointed horns, cloven hooves, and goat legs that appear in countless depictions of Satan are all borrowed from a god who once symbolized the innocent joy of life in harmony with nature. Pan's theft shows how complete the demonization process could be. Not only was his worship forbidden, but his very appearance was stolen to represent everything his original worshippers should fear. What makes all these transformations so psychologically effective is how they preserve the original god's power while completely flipping its moral meaning. The church's scholars weren't stupid. They recognized that simply declaring the old gods powerless would fail because people had experienced that power firsthand. Instead, they created a system where storm gods become demons of chaos and destruction, love goddesses become tempters leading people to sin, and nature deities become symbols of everything Christians should fear about the untamed world. This pattern reveals the political genius behind the demonization strategy. Instead of dismissing rival religions as mere superstition, which would have required convincing people that their own experiences were meaningless, Christianity absorbed them and reframed them. People who had grown up hearing stories about Baal's mighty storms or Astarte's protective love didn't have to abandon those stories entirely. They just had to learn to fear what they once celebrated. The familiar became forbidden, and the beloved became dangerous. A farmer who once prayed to Baal for rain now prayed to St. Peter for the same blessing, while fearing that his old prayers had been answered by a demon trying to claim his soul. A woman who once asked Astarte's protection in childbirth now sought the Virgin Mary's intercession, while believing her grandmother's rituals had involved trafficking with devils. In this way, the new religion could acknowledge the old gods' reality while making worship of them not just wrong, but terrifying. This demonization process became even more sophisticated when Christian theologians began creating direct opposites to the fallen gods. They didn't just condemn the old deities, they built an entire counter-mythology where Christian saints and angels served as the proper holy alternatives to the demonic powers. This wasn't accidental. Church scholars deliberately constructed a system where every demon had a corresponding Christian figure who could defeat them, creating a spiritual battlefield where the new faith always had the stronger champion. Take Beelzebub, the former storm god Baal. Medieval texts don't just list him as a powerful demon, they specifically identify Saint Michael the Archangel as his opposite and enemy. Michael, whose name means "who is like God," becomes the Christian storm warrior who wields divine lightning instead of demonic tempests. Where Beelzebub brings destructive winds and plague, Michael brings the cleansing winds of heaven and protection from disease. The iconography is almost identical. Both are depicted as mighty warriors commanding the powers of the sky, but Michael's storms bring salvation while Beelzebub's bring damnation. This pattern repeats across the entire pantheon of demonized gods. Astarte, the fallen queen of heaven, finds her opposite in the Virgin Mary, who claims Astarte's old title as Queen of Heaven, but purified of all sexual content. Where Astarte celebrated fertility and passion, Mary embodies virginal purity. Where Astarte's 8-pointed star marked temples of sacred sexuality, Mary's star represents divine guidance toward chastity. Even their visual depictions mirror each other. Both are beautiful women associated with celestial bodies, but Mary's beauty inspires spiritual devotion while Astaroth's supposedly leads to carnal corruption. The psychological brilliance of this system is that it preserved everything people loved about their old gods while redirecting that devotion toward approved Christian figures. A sailor who once prayed to Astarte for safe passage could now pray to Mary, Star of the Sea, for the same protection. A farmer seeking good weather could turn from Baal to Saint Michael. The emotional needs remained the same, but the spiritual technology for meeting those needs got completely rebranded. Even Pan's transformation reveals this pattern. While Satan inherited Pan's physical appearance, Saint Francis of Assisi became his spiritual opposite. Where Pan represented wild, uncontrolled nature, Francis embodied nature in harmony with divine will. Both lived outdoors and communicated with animals. Both represented alternatives to urban civilization. But Francis's connection to nature was seen as holy, while Pan's was now demonic. Francis could preach to birds and tame wolves because he channeled divine power, while Pan's ability to charm animals became evidence of diabolic influence. This creates a fascinating mirror world where the same basic spiritual needs and experiences get divided into opposing camps. Storm magic exists, but it's either Michael's divine lightning or Beelzebub's demonic tempests. Communication with nature happens, but it's either Francis's holy communion with creation or Pan's diabolic seduction by wild forces. Female divine power operates, but it's either Mary's pure intercession or Astaroth's corrupting influence. The system even extends to lesser-known transformations. Moloch, the Ammonite god who received child sacrifice, finds his opposite in various child-protecting saints. Mercury, the messenger god who became the demon Malthus, gets countered by Saint Gabriel, the archangel of divine messages. Hecate, goddess of crossroads and magic who became various demons associated with witchcraft, faces opposition from countless saints who specialized in defeating magical attacks. What makes this particularly clever is how it acknowledges that the old gods' powers were real, while claiming Christian figures have superior versions of the same abilities. The Church didn't deny that pagan rituals worked. They argued that demons had been granting those prayers to trap souls, while Christian prayer accessed the same benefits through holy means. A healing that came through invoking Asclepius was demonic deception, but the same healing through St. Luke's intercession was miraculous grace. But the transformation of gods into demons wasn't always clean and systematic. Sometimes the process got messy, creating cases where scholars still debate whether a particular demon originated from a specific god or developed through other means. These mythological crossovers and misidentifications reveal how folklore, theology, and cultural memory blended in unpredictable ways as Christianity spread across diverse populations. One of the most intriguing examples involves the demon Valak, who appears in the Lesser Key of Solomon as a president of hell commanding 36 legions. Valak is described as a small child with angel's wings who rides a two-headed dragon and specializes in revealing the locations of hidden treasures and serpents. On the surface, this seems like pure medieval imagination. What ancient god could this possibly represent? But when you dig deeper into Slavic mythology, you find Veles, the ancient god of cattle, wealth, magic, and the underworld. Veles was often depicted as a serpent or dragon, and he was specifically associated with hidden treasures and the ability to reveal secret knowledge. Slavic folklore describes him as a shapeshifter who could appear in many forms, including as a child. The linguistic connection is tentative. Valak might derive from Veles, or it might be coincidence, but the functional similarities are striking. This uncertainty is actually typical of how demonization worked in practice. When Christianity encountered the complex web of Slavic, Celtic, Germanic, and other European folk beliefs, the process of sorting gods into demons wasn't always systematic. Sometimes a single deity got split into multiple demons. Sometimes several gods got combined into one demonic figure. Sometimes the connections got so tangled that even medieval scholars weren't sure which demon corresponded to which original deity. The demon Belphegor provides another example of this complexity. Medieval grimoires describe him as a demon of sloth who tempts people through ingenious inventions and discoveries that lead them away from spiritual concerns. Some scholars connect him to the Moabite god Baal Peor, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as a deity the Israelites were forbidden to worship. But others argue that Belphegor developed independently from folkloric traditions about lazy spirits, with the Baal connection added later to give him more ancient authority. Similarly, the demon Andromalius, who appears in grimoires as a great earl of hell who punishes thieves and recovers stolen goods, might derive from various justice gods whose names have been lost to history. His function, catching criminals and returning stolen property, clearly comes from divine justice traditions, but which specific god he represents remains unclear. Archaeological evidence suggests many cultures had similar justice deities, but their names and exact attributes didn't always survive the transition to Christian demonology. These unclear cases reveal something important about how religious transformation actually works in practice. It's not always a neat process of one-to-one correspondence between old god and new demon. Instead, it's often messy, creative, and influenced by local conditions, individual scholars' decisions, and the practical needs of people trying to make sense of conflicting traditions. The Celtic world provides especially complex examples because Celtic religion varied dramatically by region, and much of it was never written down before Christian conversion. When Irish monks compiled lists of demons in their manuscripts, they sometimes included figures that were clearly Celtic gods, but they also included entities that might have been local spirits, folk heroes, or even fictional beings created to fill gaps in their demonic hierarchies. The demon Crocel, described as a great duke of hell who appears as an angel and teaches geometry and liberal arts, might derive from various Celtic wisdom gods, but the connection isn't certain. The demon Glasia Labalas, who supposedly appears as a dog with griffin wings and teaches all arts and sciences, has attributes that suggest connection to shape-shifting Celtic deities, but again, the specific source is unclear. What's certain is that the process continued long after the initial wave of Christian conversion. Folk beliefs about local spirits, seasonal celebrations, and magical practices kept getting absorbed into the expanding catalogue of demonic entities. A medieval peasant story about a helpful household spirit might get recorded by a monk as evidence of demonic activity. A traditional healer's knowledge about herbs might get reinterpreted as trafficking with demons of medicine and poison. This ongoing absorption created a situation where the grimoires and demonology texts of the late medieval and early modern periods contain layer upon layer of transformed religious material. Some demons clearly derive from major ancient gods like Baal and Astarte. Others come from minor local deities whose names barely survived in folklore. Still others might represent folk beliefs, mythological creatures, or even fictional entities created by scholars trying to reach the traditional number of 72 demons that King Solomon supposedly commanded. The result is a complex supernatural ecosystem where former gods, nature spirits, folk heroes, and pure imagination all got mixed together under the single category of demon. This mixing makes it difficult to trace exact origins, but it also reveals the incredible richness of the spiritual traditions that Christianity encountered and absorbed during its expansion across the ancient and medieval world. Sadly, much of this history is fragmented, with only scattered mentions of gods turned demons in texts that often don't explain their reasoning or sources. Medieval grimoire writers rarely admitted they were recycling ancient deities, preferring to claim their demon lists came from King Solomon's own writings or other biblical authorities. The original contexts, the temples, rituals, myths, and lived experiences of people who worshipped these gods, got lost in the translation to demonic adversary. But piecing together the available evidence gives us a glimpse of how mythology was systematically rewritten by those in power. What we call demonology is actually a vast graveyard of dead religions, where the gods of conquered peoples were transformed into monsters to serve their conquerors' spiritual and political purposes. Understanding this process reveals not just ancient history, but the ongoing dynamics of how dominant cultures absorb and transform the beliefs of those they encounter. The next time you see a medieval manuscript listing the names and powers of demons, remember that you're looking at what might be the last surviving trace of someone's beloved deity, a god who once received prayers, offerings, and desperate pleas for help from people who believed with absolute certainty that these powers were good, protective, and worthy of devotion. Comment below which god-demon transformation you'd like me to explore next.